Howdy, y'all. I should not have just picked that off my yard. Oops. Now you may be wondering, why am I dressed like this, acting a fool? Well, actually, I'm so excited to finally be doing this video. I'm excited because I finally get to talk about one of my absolute favorite genres of literature. Today, we are discussing methods for understanding and approaching the one, the only, the Southern Gothic. Yes, I will be posting an assessment and perhaps even a defense for Southern writers. This is certainly a tricky genre to define, and the methods with which to approach reading it necessitate a lot of historical context and explanation. Lucky for you, I love nothing more than to gush about Southern writers, and I may or may not have actually specialized in this stuff in college. And of course, watch me get it all wrong and embarrass myself. It always happens. So without further ado, let this Mexican suburbanite living in California tell you all about Southern writing. But before we can get to discussing methods to approach the Southern Gothic, first we have to dissect and define exactly what we are talking about. Let's start by taking a closer look at the two words that make up the title of this rich genre of literature: Southern and Gothic. Southern is pretty straightforward, referencing the southern United States from which the literature emerges, usually considered to be the cluster of states south of New England over on the East Coast. The literature most prominently associated with the Southern Gothic seems to emerge from the southmost area of the southern region, the colloquially known Deep South, comprised of the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas. Although often southern United States is often defined as extending as far north as Virginia and as south and west as to encompass the entire state of Texas. Of the particular authors whose works I will be talking about and recommending later on in this video, almost all of them are from Georgia, a state often considered the rich and vibrant epicenter of the Southern Gothic, yet we also have a few but prominent examples from Mississippi and North Carolina. Now that we talked about the Southern, we have to talk about the Gothic. Gothic is not as easy to define. I will do my best to be succinct and clear with this historical explanation, yet it bears mentioning that defining what Gothic is and how it came to relate to a particular mode of Southern writing is no easy feat. And a true in-depth definition would require hours of explanation. I realize that Gothic is something that most people cannot define per se, but we can easily identify it and point it out given its cultural and aesthetic relevance that remains prevalent even today. Fun fact, when I first started my YouTube channel, I actually planned to do an entire video on defining Gothic literature, but eventually gave up in frustration upon realizing that the script I was writing would probably end up being a 3 to 4 hour long video. Now, however, I am prepared to be as brief yet informative as possible, so let's go. Gothic was a term that initially referred to Ostrogoths and Visigoths of Roman antiquity. In few words, they were Proto-Germanic tribes often disdained for their uncivilized brutishness and their hand in toppling the Roman Empire. Historically, this conflict between Goths and Romans was assessed as base, secular, and uncultured ferocity versus the beacon of civilization and refinement, Gothic coming to refer, of course, to the former. The term was often used retroactively during the Renaissance era, some centuries later, to describe the architecture of the Middle Ages. It was used as a mainly derogatory term for what was perceived as uncivilized dark times, as reflected by the overly ornate, overarching architecture that's become emblematic of the name Gothic. We've all seen it: the ribbed vaults, the flying buttresses, and of course the ogival pointed arches, which some Renaissance critics even disdainfully referred to as resembling the ugly primitive huts in which the Gothic savages lived. Truly, there has never been more vitriol and beef expressed against building. At this point in history, Gothic came to have a look and a negative connotation, referring to dark ages of superstition and cultural stagnation represented by architecture that was an affront to the eyes. It would not be until centuries later, in 1765, however, that a man named Horace Walpole would reclaim, in a sense, the term Gothic and apply it to the now celebrated and important body of literature, in a sense created and cemented by his novel, The Castle of Otranto. This reclamation had its roots in political and cultural rebellion, all of which could be a video on its own, but which I will summarize as this. Essentially, Walpole was tired of venerating the Roman influence of Western thought and found himself in a state of discontent over where England was seemingly heading. This state of discontent was due to creative and political reasons of the time, namely various conflicts involving the throne and British royalty, etc. Walpole, mirroring the writings of his contemporary Edmund Burke, who wrote of the powers of the sublime, that which he defined as being awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time, looked to darker, superstitious, and fantastic influences to invigorate literature through the Castle of Otranto, namely medieval times. Therefore, the look and setting of Gothic tales is so often medieval, despite being a literary form largely developed in the late 1700s and early 1800s, well after medieval times. From there on, a wide variety of writers such as Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, William Beckford, and many more essentially invented and structured an entire genre rooted in a sensationalized, darkly fantastic reimagining of the Middle Ages. There are many elements, aesthetic and picturesque symbols, and themes that comprise the Gothic genre of literature, including things like the Byronic hero, a pleasurable kind of terror, and close ties with supernatural fiction and dark romanticism. Yet the most salient component in reference to arriving at the definition of Southern Gothic is Gothic literature's obsession with and treatment of the past, and the concept of, and keep this word handy for it is important, decay. There exists within Gothic tales a strong emphasis on the past, and it is literalized and represented by things like abandoned churches, forgotten lore, superstitious beliefs re-emerging, ghosts appearing, which all amount to that aestheticized decay which Gothic literature is famous for. Gothic fiction is all about that ravaged, desecrated, and haunted history that inspired Walpole in the first place. Now, all of this is going on in England, yet how exactly do we make the connection between a British literary tradition deeply rooted in its history and the vastly different American imagination with its own quite different history and culture? This connection is actually perfectly embodied by and facilitated by a single man whose life was meek and short, and who yet made history with his short, grotesque, and vivid tales of madness and death. That man, of course, was Edgar Allan Poe. Poe not only permanently wove Gothic sensibilities into the American literary imagination, thanks to his obsessions with monomanias, decay, man's madness and flaws, and the allures of the unknown, but his connection to the American South specifically is stronger than you may have initially thought. Although widely associated with New England and even nicknamed the Bostonian, Poe had a great deal of love and admiration for the American South, particularly Richmond, Virginia, where he was briefly stationed in his youth when he joined the military temporarily, and which he actually referred to on numerous occasions as his true home. Poe was enamored with southern panoramas, a picturesque fancy that actually greatly influenced his writing. Even though his American contemporaries cared little for him, various European authors involved with the supernatural and Gothic admired Poe's work, including famed Gothic and symbolist authors like Oscar Wilde and Charles Baudelaire, who encountered his works well after Poe's death, but nonetheless assured that they would be immortalized in the Gothic literary canon. In fact, Wilde and Baudelaire might well be the reason why we even still read Poe to this day. Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, in particular, has a uniquely American sense of place and dread, along with tackling issues of repressed sexuality, incest, and illness, which proved invaluable inspiration for future Southern Gothic authors, giving American fiction a taste of decay that would only increase in its cultural resonance as the South's war-torn history soon unfolded. Understanding the antebellum and postbellum South would be impossible, however, if we were to approach it with literary and artistic merits alone. Although the South has always produced great writers, in my opinion at least, its identity is hardly tied to artistic expression. Indeed, one of the greatest dichotomies and cultural divides that formed within these early years of American history, and the schism of which is still felt today, is the separation between the North and the South in terms of culture, progressive thinking, and appreciation for the arts. The North, New England, became the epicenter of progressive politics, black liberation, and artistic development. The South, culturally, was the country of labor, the country of the railroad. It was the rural nation, the country of the value of honest work, self-sufficiently, and obsessions with its own means of production. Parentheses, slavery. The Southern people were the common people, the hardworking people, all leading to that elevation of what we know as Southern pride. Ironically, however, I find that this distancing that the South has from the written arts is actually what gives Southern literature such a unique, peculiar, and ultimately powerful voice. The working man, the impoverished woman, the spiritually confused man, the ruined woman. These Southern archetypes are vastly divorced from the artistic literary population, and yet Southern authors all found that the working class's voice is actually imperative to understanding Southern culture, and the stories that these voices have to tell are powerful, engrossing, and devastating. So how exactly did Southern literature arrive at the dark, brooding, and violent conclusion of becoming the Southern Gothic? Well, very much the same way that England developed their own mode of Gothic literature, by looking back and focusing on, here's that word I asked you to hold on to, decay. Like Gothic literature in Europe, the Southern Gothic is also obsessed with the past and a sense of place. However, the geographical and historical past of the Southern United States looks vastly different from that of Europe. For instance, we can think of it this way. Instead of medieval cathedrals, the South is haunted by abandoned plantations. Instead of castles, American specters nestle in urban decay, derelict homes, and racial violence. The ghosts of Southern Gothic are racism, the Civil War, poverty, and the broken mind of the Southern man is plagued by the madness withdrawn from a wounded Southern pride. The Civil War forever marked the South unlike anything else ever did. Cultural perception of the South from this point of emancipation on turned into an understanding of the South as an ugly, regressive, brutally racist, and ignorant cultural blight, greatly contrasting with previous highly regarded Southern values centered around properness, high class, pride, and honesty. Perhaps this is why the Southern Gothic is so obsessed with transgressive thoughts. Characters of the genre are often obsessive, impulsive, self-destructive, and have a skewed perspective on life and its meaning. This cultural shunning from the rest of the country may also explain why the Southern United States is often perceived as being culturally isolated, and thus its people often suffer from alienation and mistrust towards others. Both qualities are also highly prevalent in Southern writing. Race and religion are, of course, perhaps the biggest elements, the biggest baggage that Southern writers carry. They are culturally resonant artifacts that are imbued into the essence of the South. Relationships between white and black people are portrayed as violent, uneasy, and often the source of existential conundrums and ravaging encounters. Words like the N word, terminology like mixed, Creole, pure, passing, etc., are all parts of the Southern cast that will become too familiar the more you explore this genre. Man's beliefs as they relate to race and existence, the history of slavery, emancipation, the Confederacy, ardent Protestantism, all carry over into the Southern Gothic as existentialist, torturous, and crazed questions. Religion and the secular often intertwine in horrific ways in the Southern Gothic. The plight of this genre often consists of a character's ambivalence between religious obsession and humility, and secular pleasures and patriarchal impulses, aka sex, God, money, and guns. The South, being deeply Protestant, often resorts to Southern Gothic writing to try to make sense of and answer questions revolving around faith, the terrible speed of mercy, and religious love as an extension of violent, transgressive behaviors. Author Flannery O'Connor, who is my favorite author of the Southern Gothic and who I will quote more than once in this video, perhaps said it best. I think it is safe to say that while the South is hardly Christ-centered, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. The Southerner, who isn't convinced of it, is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. Ghosts can be fierce and instructive. They cast strange shadows, particularly in our literature. Now, before I go on, I want to pause and clarify a few things, especially because I know I may have some viewers who are actually from the South, and I am fully aware that my explanations of Southern literature, which are highly laden with what could be perceived as slanderous generalizations, may be coming across as offensive or uninformed. Of course, I am by no means saying that the Southern United States is all just a racist, impoverished, derelict, mentally unwell, and violent region. Especially with today's political climate, I believe that the majority of the nation has subscribed to this negative view of the Southern United States. Yet and I don't care how controversial this might sound, personally have a lot of faith in the true kind-heartedness and values that Southern people have carried with them throughout the years, and greatly empathize with the struggles with poverty and cultural shunning which they have faced, and which honestly resonate along with me as a Mexican immigrant. In fact, when I was in college, I constantly collaborated with faculty and fellow students who were from the regions of Alabama and Georgia, and their input was invaluable, and their stories and presence were unique and wonderful. This may be self-evident, but not to everyone, I'm sure, so I do want to make it clear. None of this discussion is meant to generalize these negative qualities as being true of every single person that lives in the South, regardless of race. Yet even the very Southern people I have met throughout my life would be the first to agree, actually. There is a questionable faith, and there exist high racial tensions that come with the Southern territory that simply cannot be ignored. In fact, Southern writers themselves were often confronted with this question and accused by critics who thought they were painting a horrific and sensationalized picture of what life in the South was like. The question was essentially, why is Southern Gothic so messed up? To this question, and to answer why I am touching upon such difficult and controversial topics, and to nicely segue us into the section of this video in which I discuss methods of how to read the Southern Gothic, I hereby insert another celebrated and powerful quote by Flannery O'Connor. Whenever I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks, I say it is because we are still able to recognize one. For our first of two bullet points on the methods of how to approach Southern Gothic literature, let's unpack this mentioning of freaks by O'Connor. Freakishness is actually a staple of Southern Gothic stories, namely in the form of deformities. Characters often suffer from physical deformity. We have hunchbacks, amputees, people with limps, wooden legs, cross eyes, etc., and it often contrasts with their usually amiable or wise character. Beyond the physical deformity, however, freaks in Southern writing can also be perceived as the violent, erratic, stubborn, racist, and merciless characters that often lead these tales. However, what O'Connor says in her quote is not that freaks plague only the South or are exclusive to the South, but rather that Southern writers are particularly adept at identifying and writing about them. An obvious jab at the fact that perhaps the rest of the nation isn't. Thus, method number one for reading Southern Gothic is this: look for the social commentary. More specifically, to read Southern Gothic, we must identify and appreciate the kind of social commentary that seems to be entirely absent from the rest of American literature. The reason why the Southern Gothic is such a unique voice in American literature and why these authors are so celebrated for their painfully human portrayals is because they reach into that ravaging side of history that the rest of the United States seems to have forgotten or repressed. After all, we live in a nation built by black slaves on top of native genocide and facilitated by exploited immigrant labor. This fact, however, is highly obfuscated in most of the rest of American literature, yet it bleeds and gushes with pummeling force in the Southern Gothic. Thus, the social commentary present in the Southern Gothic should be regarded, in my opinion, as containing a heavier tone of honesty than its other contemporary regional works. Especially in the middle of the 20th century, when the genre was most prolific, authors like William Faulkner, Eudora Welty, and Flannery O'Connor all infused their writing with the stark voice of honesty, elevating the status of Southern writing, ironically, because the popular opinion of the South was so low. Cultural slights empowered the voice of the South. The South became the outlet for the rest of America's frustrations, and yet that's what gave it limitless potential. The South recognizes what other reaches of civilization aim to bury and ignore, makes it central to its composition. Racism, violence, ignorance, and poverty exist virtually all across the nation, yet for literature of the 20th century, what went largely unaddressed by the rest of the supposedly more civilized body of literary artists, the South undertook as its vital force of narrative prowess. Often you will hear of the Southern Gothic as being a prolific example of what's known as the grotesque. Grotesquerie meaning the ugly, unpleasant, brutal, and vicious aesthetics employed in Southern Gothic writing, deeply reflects the overall cultural discontent that was prescient in American life during the flourishing of the genre and really up to today. Southern writers in the wake of emancipation and in the decades leading up to the civil rights movement often saw their culture and the United States in general as a failed existence, a societal disenchantment, a ruse. Thus, Southern Gothic characters are often physically and spiritually maimed, and their souls are divided, and their lives are in a state of permanent decay, violence, and ravaging poverty. The Southern Gothic exemplifies all the social and existential problems lurking underneath this seemingly prosperous and immaculate American charm. And you will not get a better taste of disillusionment and thematic sobriety than by reading this genre. My second suggestion for a method with which to approach Southern Gothic literature is to confront the race problem. It seems to me that one of the biggest complaints that come from people attempting to read the genre is that the racism appears overt and central, and to ignore it or brush it aside to some reads as excusing and allowing such centrally racist sentiments to continue to exist within the core of American literature. As I mentioned previously, the hurling of slurs, the rigid definitions of the types and characters of race are prevalent, and of course, among the various authors of the Southern Gothic, there must certainly exist a handful who were actually racist and held onto those racist beliefs throughout their lives. Even the most celebrated writers like William Faulkner, who openly denounced racism, white supremacy, and extreme acts of racial violence, has been heavily criticized in recent years for treading cautiously on the subject of integration and desegregation. Flannery O'Connor, who I just mentioned as my favorite author of the genre, herself was very recently cancelled. In the equivalent of racist tweets resurfacing or whatever, letters she wrote as a young woman became known, in which she expressed both overt mistrust towards young blacks riding the same bus as her when she was a teenager, and later in her life a distaste for colored folk, as she called it, when writing to a friend. Of course, a lot of the context of these letters is highly misconstrued. O'Connor's racist sentiments as a teenager evidently vanished later in her life, for later she expressed great appreciation for black authors like James Baldwin, and even stirred up a storm by openly voting for and endorsing the progressive candidate John F. Kennedy during the presidential election, all while living at the heart of conservative Georgia. Her letter to her friend, many experts have argued, was laden with sarcasm, in which she liked to jokingly write in the tone of a concerned Southern woman while speaking to her friend, and experts argue that she didn't really actually mean what she said about colored folk. Of course, so many years later, and with O'Connor long gone, there's no way to verify the subtext and tone of these letters, and only her harmful words remain, causing such controversy that her name was actually removed from a lecture hall at a university in Georgia, which was previously named after her to commemorate her legacy as one of the most celebrated writers of the state. Now, I understand. Many people will simply choose not to read something if it even has the semblance of racist sentiment, or if the language it deploys is not considered politically correct by today's standards. You know, I get that. I really do. And me being from Mexico / California and being highly disconnected from what actual life in the South is like, does not lend much credence to my words. I mean, look at me, I'm wearing a stupid hat. And there's really not much argument I can make to convince people otherwise. By saying I enjoy the writings of Faulkner and O'Connor, it might also be enough for some people to automatically mute and shun me, and I guess I am ready to accept that as well. However, I can state my case to say that most of the readings and interpretations that simply conclude that racism is at the heart of Southern Gothic and there's no other value to it are heavily misguided and rid of nuance. I believe that Southern Gothic literature, and Southern literature in general, is extremely valuable if only because it is a voice that comes directly from the source of most of the racial conflict that exists throughout America. Where most other celebrated white writers in the crucial decades of the middle of the 20th century simply commented on and observed racism from a detached place, Southern Gothic narrators speak directly from the source of the fire, and those words are stunning, powerful, and incredibly salient to understanding American culture. Of course, one of the main arguments that I have against this notion that the Southern Gothic is highly aestheticized racist vitriol is that some of its biggest and most celebrated contributors are black. You have authors like Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston, and Toni Morrison. However, it is self-evident that the Southern Gothic pantheon is a largely white one. But to dismiss it on these terms would be to dismiss meaningful, in-depth, powerful, and marginal discussions of race that, to me at least, are just too important to ignore. As I mentioned, several of the authors of the Southern Gothic were perhaps shy about being overt on black issues, and yes, some of their views might well be outdated today, and yes, some of them might have actually just been racist. Yet, a lot of the Southern Gothic, however obliquely, grapples with race issues in a way so haunting and dynamic it is hard to find any other genre that is as direct in their explications of the existential and societal issues of race. O'Connor's short story, Everything That Rises Must Converge, allows us a metaphysical look at the question of racial identity and aggression. Faulkner dedicates an entire section to the consciousness of a black woman witnessing white misery while holding on to her pride and self-worth in The Sound and the Fury. And even the sensationalized tales of conjuring and hoodoo of the antebellum South reveal at their core a bleak and virile view of concepts of white anxieties and fears, powerfully articulating themes of miscegenation, cultural identity, and community local color in ways no other stories articulated before or since. In our current age of identity politics, I know of many readers who seem inclined to automatically ignore and devalue a white perspective on issues of race, whilst forgetting whiteness is one big side of the issue that merits its own analysis and closer look. That is why it is my suggestion to actively look for these instances of racial discourse in the Southern Gothic literature if you're going to read it, rather than just ignore the genre altogether. I suggest that you do this as a way to get a fuller view of American issues around race and identity. Whether you like it or not, this is America and we must witness it. Okay, I admit, that was a lot. And I have to be honest, I'm not even sure if I made a lot of sense throughout most of it, but that's why I have you, so you can let me know if you even understood any of the things that I said. Well, finally, I have arrived at the most exciting and important part of the video, the one where I recommend books to people interested in exploring this genre. Now, I have another admission. I have a lot of books to recommend. As I told you, I'm a big fan of this genre, and so I have read a lot of the works that are included in it, and I have loved a lot of it, and I want you to read a lot of it too. However, I do want to be mindful of the length of this video. I will be recommending 7 novels and 3 short stories to get you started with Southern Gothic, but in the interest of time, I will only be naming the titles and authors, along with just a few lines on why you should be interested in each work. Of course, if you are interested in hearing more about any particular work that I will mention, we always have the comments section to facilitate further discussions. Okay, so buckle up. Here we go. First on this list of works that I will recommend is a work whose classification as Southern Gothic may be contested, yet one which I recommend as cultural and historical context on American mythology and supernatural tales. For the first recommendation, I recommend Conjure Woman and Other Conjure Tales by Charles W. Chesnutt, first published in 1899. Chesnutt was a Southern author from Fayetteville, North Carolina, who had both white and black ancestry. He was mixed, but he was white passing. Again, like I told you, you will have to grow used to this disturbing, exhausting language. Inspired by slave-era traditional storytelling and myths centered around hoodoo and witching, these stories, while certainly not dealing with contemporary societal issues in the South, certainly lend a backdrop of mysticism, metamorphosis, and the supernatural and horrific violent encounters that are sure to expertly set the tone for your later explorations of the genre. The book consists of tales of conjuring and bewitching told by the former enslaved man Julius McAdoo, and they are written in Southern dialect in which tone and inflection are verbally written out. They may be a bit difficult to get through because of this, but I assure you these tales are spellbinding and haunting. And the story Dave's Necklace in particular, I have been unable to shake off years after reading it. Next, I am legally obligated to recommend to you a work by William Faulkner, the Mississippi born Nobel Prize laureate. I was debating over which work of his to recommend, which would have to be the most accessible, and the answer really was none of them. For me, it came down to either The Sound and the Fury or As I Lay Dying. The Sound and the Fury is my personal favorite of the two, but I will be recommending As I Lay Dying since I feel it's the most accessible of the two. Uh, Published in 1930, yes, Faulkner is a difficult writer. His style is infused with that modernist stream of consciousness that so many people find infuriating. Yet once you focus and train your eyes to his voice and to recognize the stories he is attempting to tell, you will realize how important he is as a writer. And more than that, I think you'll actually come to understand why he has such a difficult time making sense and being clear. As I Lay Dying is a story about familial loss and familial duty and disjointed narration, and lots of it. There's like 12 different narrators inside this novel. Basically, it centers around the transportation of a dead body, the body of a matriarch, across Mississippi to give her a proper burial. Faulkner's tale is frustrated, stubborn, and the characters are depraved and sexual, flawed, fickle, and infuriating. And thus, this book is one of the most honest and potent tales of grief, sorrow, and the flawed human condition. This is absolutely a must read for anyone interested in the Southern Gothic, and don't let Faulkner intimidate you, because if you just push through it, it'll be really, really rewarding. Trust me. Following Faulkner, I am recommending God's Little Acre by Erskine Caldwell, first published in 1933. Caldwell, born in Georgia and later settled in South Carolina, was a highly controversial writer for exploring taboo subjects throughout his literature, such as explicit sexuality and incest, and is perhaps most remembered for his other novel, Tobacco Road. Yet to me, God's Little Acre is on an entirely different level of ravaging and profound. The perversity of the family structure is perhaps something most of us are uncomfortable addressing or acknowledging that it even exists, let alone writing an entire novel about it. Yet Caldwell's novel zooms in so directly into these pressing and vulnerable issues of family dynamics and the more violent and treacherous sides of familial love, and of course the questions of money and poverty that he raises and which are unignorable. Caldwell's novel is about an obsession with finding gold, with social structures and class-based beliefs, and the slow and harrowing destruction that monetary questions deliver on the human psyche. And it's something that Caldwell is well tuned into. Caldwell is an amazing writer, and this, in my opinion, is his best work. Now, I do have to acknowledge, we must tread carefully on some of his opinions. Caldwell later on came out as a proponent of eugenics, and he supported the sterilization of poor whites. This fact certainly lends a lot of disturbing tinges on the misery and misfortunes of the South's classist systems that are so prevalent in his work. Despite this, or perhaps because of this, I find that his work should really be discussed and dissected by many more people, and this is, I think, the best place to start. I am also recommending that you read Georgia's own Carson McCullers, and specifically her novella, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, first published in 1951. This is truly one of the most grueling portraits of love and betrayal that I have ever read. One of the principal things I enjoyed about this story is McCullers' imagining of a strong and independent female character, and the constant trials and slights that she faces living in the South. It's a story about unraveling, coming undone. It's about falling in love and being vulnerable, and the intrinsically violent nature of the lover slash beloved dynamic. The characters are staples of the Southern Gothic genre, deformed, flawed, prone to violent mood swings and physical altercations, and it all lends this sort of freakish, grotesque, and stunningly human tone and aesthetics that, of course, the genre is famous for. This is a shorter read, but I assure you it is captivating and very seductive. Next up, Flannery O'Connor, arguably Georgia's most celebrated author. She published two novels in her lifetime, Wise Blood and The Violent Bear It Away. Like with Faulkner, I had to make the decision to recommend her most accessible work first, that being The Violent Bear It Away. The Violent Bear It Away, first published in 1960, 4 years before her death from her lifelong battle with lupus. As you can imagine, with this lifelong battle with her illness, death figures prominently in O'Connor's works. The Violent Bear It Away begins with a death, which soon unfolds into a fervent contest between faith, religion, and the secular and the purpose of life in general. O'Connor was a devout Catholic, which is a strange sight for the largely Protestant South, and the difference between her faith and the rest of her communities boils down to what she perceived as Southern Christianity's hypocrisy. O'Connor felt that Southern people led two separate lives, one seemingly devoted to worshiping God and His Word, and the other was much baser, secular, greedy, and spiritually flawed, as reflected by the number of atrocities and signs of greed that she witnessed growing up. This is essentially what the character in her novel, Francis Tarwater, deals with as he develops throughout the story, and what O'Connor felt was the violent reckoning of a man being confronted with the questions of faith. Of course, there is freakish, grotesque, and religious imagery to spare, and this gives O'Connor's work such force and also makes them so weird and odd and interesting. Honestly, I also recommend that you read Wise Blood, which is even stranger and freakier than The Violent Bear It Away. And double honesty, just why don't you just read all of her short stories? They're all amazing in my opinion. Or, okay, if you just want to be particular, I recommend A Good Man is Hard to Find, Everything That Rises Must Converge, Good Country People, and The Temple of the Holy Ghost. Those are all time-honored classics, and I assure you will not regret it, and you will want to read more. Moving on, I am recommending an autobiographical work by another author from Georgia, Harry Crews, titled A Childhood, a Biography of a Place, first published in 1978. Crews is mostly known for his brutal prose, his grotesque subject matter, this is all familiar to you now, and his tortured characters, and his own life is certainly no exception to the kind of writing that he does. Crews' telling of his living experience in the Deep South, facing poverty, educational obstacles, and violent encounters is admittedly perhaps over-stylized and sensationalized beyond just the solid truth, but to me that does not disprove his real ability to capture hardship and immortalize it as a staple of the American human condition. His autobiography is replete with physical and mental injuries, with problems centering around language and expression. And just be warned, there's also meat. Lots and lots of meat. And with meat comes mutilation, skinning, boiling, you name it. His writing is one of a kind, and his telling of his own life is certainly the best place to start with his works. Brutally Honest just begins to scratch at the surface of his genius. And finally, as far as novels go, I want to top this series of recommendations with what I believe to be the true crowning jewel of Southern Gothic writing, Toni Morrison's Beloved, first published in 1987. Morrison, with her family history based in Alabama and Georgia, single-handedly crafted and spearheaded a literary movement of a new kind of Southern Gothic tradition, in which a reassessment of the grotesque and the supernatural symbols prolifically used in the genre served for her as powerful ideas to articulate and make sense of the horrors and violence of slavery and racism. Morrison's novel deals with maternal love and the poisoning of that very love in the face of hardship, persecution, and bondage. I have truly never read any other work that so brilliantly and astutely captured the essence of a Southern American history in such horrific and visceral terms. Morrison's vision of a pained and injured history may resist classification on its own because it's been called a slavery novel, it's been called a supernatural drama, it's been called a horror novel, but I think all of these categories are neatly tied into the label of Southern Gothic. And so I choose to recommend this brilliant and amazing novel to anyone interested not just in the Southern Gothic genre, but in American history in general, and in the experiences, traumas, and violence that Black women in our nation have overcome. To me, this is the best work of Southern Gothic fiction that we have yet seen. Now, before I close off this roster of recommendations, I do want to say that the Southern Gothic does exist prolifically in the short story form as well, and so I wanted to quickly rattle off 3 recommendations of Southern Gothic short stories that I think deserve your interest as well. First, Old Mortality by Catherine Ann Porter, which you can find collected in a volume of all her short fiction. Porter is not really associated with the Southern Gothic genre, yet Old Mortality deals with childhood trauma, the female Southern experience, the horrors of the flesh, and our endless journey for redemption. And it's so quiet and so vivid that I just have to recommend it. I also recommend Keela, the Outcast Indian Maiden by short story titan Eudora Welty. Or, I mean, really, just go ahead and get the entire collection of her short stories as well. Keela, the Outcast Indian Maiden, however, in specific, is gripping, grotesque, unsettling, and it's entirely written as a conversation about Black bodies, alienation, and Southern racial tension. It's amazing, and it's pretty short too, so if you like your forays into new genres to be on the shorter, briefer side, then that's a good option for you, I would say. Finally, I would also like to recommend The Revenge of Hannah Camuff by Alice Walker, which is contained in her short story collection In Love and Trouble. Alice Walker is perhaps mostly known for her novel The Color Purple, which I have mentioned previously on this channel, and which I do think is an extremely important example of Southern writing, but The Revenge of Hannah Camuff belongs to the Southern Gothic body specifically. Central to the story are racism, revenge, of course, but also deep views into resentment, bigotry, and a callback to Chesnutt's usage of Conjure and hoodoo. The story, to me, is highly humorous, and it contains perhaps one of the most shocking endings to a story that I have ever experienced. So, there you go. Well, there you have it. Those are all of my thoughts on the Southern Gothic, along with my recommendations on how and what to read. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. I understand it's difficult, and there's a lot of difficult and controversial topics involved in this discussion, but which are nonetheless, to me, important and necessary to talk about. So far, my comment sections have been very civil. They've been filled with intelligent and engaged people. So I continue to appreciate each and every one of you for that reason. And of course, appreciate you for your continued support and all of your kind words. They really do mean the world to me. So let me know your own experience with the Southern Gothic. Have you read any of the works I talked about before? which authors did I fail to mention? Or if you're from the South specifically, your input and commentary is greatly welcomed and appreciated. Also, of course, any corrections are welcomed and encouraged as well, as I am sure to have botched or misconstrued a thing or two, or several. I don't know. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can follow me on Instagram, which I will link in the description. Don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I have made other videos in this How and What to Read series. I made one for Native American literature, and I made another one for queer horror. So be sure to check those out as well if you are interested. I guess I can start a playlist for those now or something. Oh, and another thing that I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for helping me reach over 300 subscribers. As always, I don't know what to say about that. It's just incredible to me, and it's the reason why I'm still going and I have so much hope. Thank you so much. Some of you have asked if I can do a bookshelf tour for a whole video of it. I'm definitely going to do that as a 300 subscriber special of sorts. Well, I have to say, I have never, believe it or not, I have never really watched any bookshelf tour videos, so I don't know the format. And I also have to add, my bookshelf is pretty small, so I don't know if it'll be that entertaining, but I'm gonna figure it out, and I'm gonna make it interesting, and I'm gonna put it out. I promise. As always, I hope you are well. I hope everyone has a beautiful day. I hope everyone stays safe. Let me know if you read any of the works that I recommended in this video, and I will see you in the next one. Godspeed.